to join us, and Pernell is going to introduce himself, and I will just say that we are happy to have you with us again, and I'm looking forward to it.
Thanks, Josephine. Welcome, everybody. It's a little weird sitting in a room by myself and pretending like I'm actually talking to real people, but I assume that behind these little icons are actually real people in real places across this amazing nation. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about my story, but I thought the first thing that we might do is maybe look at where we're actually going to go today. So I found this picture and thought that when it comes to leading compelling missional communities, this arrow, big arrow with all kinds of little arrows in the middle, kind of summed up how I feel about the whole thing. I am by no means a guru when it comes to leadership. I've been a pastor for 17 years, and in that time I definitely feel like I'm learning some things about leadership. And I hope to share some of those things that I am learning and honing and trying to master. So basically the rundown will be this. I'm going to introduce myself and kind of where I've been. And that helps shape the story and the narrative of leadership for me. I'm going to present a couple of images of leadership that I found helpful. I'm going to talk about some what I feel are really crucial components of leading missional communities. And then I'm going to talk about some skills and capacities that I believe leaders need in this day and age. And then we'll have time for some Q&A. And in the meantime, I may see your questions and stop. And if I don't, then at the end, I'm sure Josephine will remind me because she's very good at that kind of thing. So thanks for having me with you. And the first thing I want to tell you is that there's very few things I've done well in my life, but I did marry well. And so I married up, and my wife and I have 3 beautiful kids, Samantha, Lucas, and Jacob, and they're 14, 12, and 10 years old. And very much ever since we started a family, for my wife and I, we have been on mission together as a family. And learning some unique things. I started out my pastoral career as a youth pastor in Barrie, Ontario. I stayed there for about 4.5 years, and then I lived in Calgary for a couple of years where I was receiving church planting training. And then subsequently we moved to Hamilton, Ontario in 2001, and we planted a church called the Freeway for the Salvation Army in the 3rd poorest neighborhood in Canada, one of the most under-resourced neighborhoods in Canada. We renovated a CIBC bank building into a fair trade cafe. And so basically we created a third place in downtown Hamilton. It was open all through the week where people could come and buy fair trade coffee and home-baked goodies and sandwiches and such. They could hang out and be in community, use free Wi-Fi. We had live music twice a week. We had community workshops, particularly for people who struggle for one reason or another, either mental health issues, developmental challenges, poverty-related issues, or homelessness issues. And we also had art shows that we performed there. And so there was a real cool little community that formed of neighbors in that neighborhood and of local artists and musicians, along with professionals and young people who all kind of moved into that neighborhood and decided to live there. And it was a really great experience. And in starting that community and staying there for 10 years, I certainly learned a lot about myself, and I think I learned a lot about how Jesus calls us to move in and become our incarnational in neighborhoods and communities. And so recently my family and I moved to London, Ontario, and we have this strange experience of, I'm a pastor now at a church called Hillside, which is a 125-year-old Baptist congregation. And so coming in with the same convictions and the same skill set and capacities into a completely, totally different kind of context, living in the suburbs of London, Ontario, and being part of a well-established church, has meant that new challenges when it comes to leadership. And so all of the things that I'm going to share with you today are not original to me. I've learned a lot from friends and from actual leadership gurus and books I've read, and I've tried and practiced some of these things. And so what I want to share with you is basically the culmination of a bunch of experience. I tried to prepare things that perhaps you would be maybe a little bit unfamiliar with in order to give some new ideas and new insights. And I wanted to say, for the record, and this is being recorded so it's on the record, that I actually really like being friends. So if you want to continue an email, web, phone call, in-person conversations beyond this webinar, I would be really open to doing that. So first section I told you I wanted to talk to you about was this idea of images of leadership. I have two that I would like to pose for you. One comes from a book that I read quite a few years ago, and it wasn't a Christian leadership book, but it did have a lot to say about organization and how things work. And so the analogy, the image, the picture used is that of Starfish and the spider. And I find both of these animals helpful when it comes to leadership. And so you can maybe, as I explain how, you can maybe see yourself in one of those, or perhaps a hybrid of both. But there's a major difference in spiders and starfish. And one of the differences is that the starfish has no exoskeleton. No central nervous system. So if you take a spider and chop its head off, the spider will actually die. And many organizations are established based on sort of the primary leadership role, the CEO, the senior pastor, the person with whom the buck stops. And often, if that leader is removed from the situation, the organization no longer exists because it exists solely on the back of that primary leader. However, in starfish organizations, what happens with a starfish is that if you cut off an arm of a starfish, it actually reproduces itself and becomes another whole starfish. And part of that is just based on the science of how starfish are made. And so we learned this as early fishermen realized that these starfish were a nuisance and figured the best way to handle it would be to chop them into pieces and throw them back into the ocean, and quickly realized that what they had done was actually multiplied the number of starfish. And so in starfish organizations, they're not necessarily leaderless, but they are organizations that are not central leadership, in the sense that if that leadership is gone, those things reproduce themselves. And so in these two types of organizations, basically one would live and die based on a leadership structure. The other one would actually multiply itself as it's divided from the whole. So you can pretty easily probably see the connection to leadership, and how maybe you see yourself more currently working in a spider organization, or more comfortable with the organization where there's a clear hierarchy and you know who makes decisions and with whom the buck stops, so to speak. And perhaps you actually are currently working in a spider organization, one that doesn't really have a central leader, or you can see that that's the place in which you generally like to work in leadership. I would argue that there are times in organizations and church life where both of these are actually valuable and actually needed. And part of the art form of being a leader is figuring out when to employ which one. My sense is that more and more organizations these days are leaning more towards a starfish type of a setup. But nonetheless, those are two images that I have found really helpful in terms of word pictures to describe particular types of structure. Currently, I'm part of what formerly was definitely a spider type of an organization, which now I would describe as a hybrid and is moving more and more towards a starfish type of a thing. The second leadership word picture image that I'd like to give you is one where primary leaders who want to lead compelling missional communities basically have to learn to exist in three main roles: that of the poet, the prophet, and the apostle. I believe that particularly pastoral leaders who are trying to lead communities in the midst of just crazy change that we find in the culture we're in right now, often spend a lot of time not doing any of these three, or barely getting time to do these three. And I would argue that actually the position description of all people who would like to be missional pastors somehow ultimately come down to these three things. So I'll flesh out each one for you a little bit. It's the poet who tells the story. The poet gives attention to understanding and experiencing and communicating the story of God's desire for healing and restoration of our personal, social, and physical environments. The poet is the one who stands in the midst of the people and helps communicate the story of God and articulate the story of what's happening in that community. It's in the articulation of our story that we actually create a missional imagination, that we help a group of people, a church, an organization, a small group, a house church, whatever it is, to actually imagine a new way of living, a new future, and cultivate an imagination for what it might look like to try to figure out the impulses of God in that place. The prophet is the one who forms the community. And so they develop a committed community of faithful, growing Jesus followers who understand their place as agents of spirit-guided transformation. So these are folks who are already part of the organization or church community, who the prophet helps to form and spends a great deal of time with in order to help them to go even further in the recognition of them as missionaries, as agents of God's future in the places where they find themselves. And the third one, the apostle, is actually the one who lives the story. They lead people into an authentic encounter with the lives of those who still need to know the Jesus story. This is time spent with people who are actually not part of the Jesus thing, who are not part of the kingdom of God already. And this is a place where we lead those who are forming in community into a space where they actually get to encounter authentically some of these folks, and where we encounter them ourselves. So just a bit of a description here that I've written for you. So the poets are the articulators of experience and the rememberers of tradition. The poet listens to the pain and questioning of the people and recognizes that these are cries that long to be connected with a word that calls them from beyond themselves into a place of belonging. There will be no vision of a missional people without poets living within the congregation's experience and giving voice to its desire for transformation and renewal. The prophetic imagination directs the poetic discourse of the people towards an understanding of God's purposes for them in the world at this time, addresses the hard side of discipleship, where we must face the reality that in God's kingdom, we are not the center of the universe. The prophet speaks a word which engenders hope, out of which arises a vision for transformation in the world in which we live, an authentic missional engagement. And finally, the apostle. We must lead the congregation in places where old maps no longer work. Discipling and equipping require a leadership that demonstrates encounter with the culture in action, not just teaching and sending. The apostle is one who forms a congregation into mission groups shaped by encounters with the gospel and culture, structuring the congregation shape into forms that lead people outward into a missionary encounter. And so in the image of the leader as the poet, prophet, and apostle, there's two things to take note of that are really important. One is that you'll notice that I don't believe it's the role of the primary leader to spend time with the fringe community, those who are kind of have made their way somehow into the faith community, but are not actually becoming the committed core of the community. Secondly, and this is a really important one, it basically suggests that there's a threefold division of time and energy that someone wanting to lead in compelling missional community actually has to do. And apostle is the default. And so that one actually has to be emphasized first and foremost. The poet and the prophet are actually kind of secondary to the apostle. We need to find a way, as leaders of people, who we find a way to live the story, to engage others in what living the story looks like, to invite them to live the story as well, and to model for them what living the kingdom story is actually like. Now, I read these three things in a book by Alan Roxburgh about maybe 12 years ago. And to be honest, much of my time in those past 12 years has been focused and spent trying to be those three things, trying to live in a way that those three have become the primary role for me. They're, I believe, beautiful images of what it looks like. Flies in the face a little bit of some of the leadership structures and things that I've seen, particularly in churches in my experience of dealing with church leadership teams and pastors and the way that churches have structured themselves. This is one that is sometimes hard to convince people of, that the time that traditionally particularly lead role pastors have spent are maybe not the most helpful in terms of the kingdom of God. And this is definitely sort of a poetic vision, a little bit of an artist vision perhaps of the church, perhaps even a little idealistic. But I love what G.K. Chesterton says when it comes to church and faith and the mystery of this whole thing. The mathematician tries to build a bridge across the divine. The poet swims in the sea. And if we're talking about navigating the waters of sort of a postmodern culture, a church that's really re-identifying with its mission and its identity in North American culture, I believe that more of an artist outlook on things is helpful. And so I'm going to read a couple of questions here as we finish up that section. Okay, one question is, are you going to speak to how we may transition from a spider to a starfish approach to leadership for those of us working in predominantly spider organizations? Absolutely. Let me talk about that right now. When I started the Freeway Church for the Salvation Army in Hamilton, the organization itself identified more as a spider organization, but the tribe of which I was a part is definitely a spider organization, at least for the most part. And so we coexisted within this larger system that was more spider-ish, if that's a word I can use. And so starting a new community meant that we could build an ethos from the ground up. We could build a DNA from the ground up. And so to be honest, it was a little bit easier in terms of, at the beginning, setting the tone for how we would organize ourselves and how we wouldn't. A bigger challenge has been moving to a place that traditionally has been a local community organized as a spider organization and making the transition. And so I haven't fully done that yet, and I haven't fully learned the secret, but I would say that a big part of it is, for me, has been naming and renaming what it is we're called to and how it is we should be doing this. And so we talk a lot about what the kingdom looks like. and what it means for all of us to join together as missionaries, as sent people into a context, into the world, into our neighborhood, into our workplace, in order to be used by God as people who both point to the kingdom now and the kingdom later. And so naming and vocalizing and verbalizing was one way. Another way literally was to take the position description given here and completely redrafting it, and along in cooperation with the other leaders who I lead with in community here, instituting that this should be the same position description basically for every person in leadership, that these three roles are actually the main roles we'll take. And then when leadership was on board, then we continue to communicate to the community, to the faith community, what it is we're doing. But to be honest, these things just get worked out by practicing and trying and experimenting and often being beat up for it. And my experience of leadership in the past, at least 10 or 12 years, has been both a beautiful and refreshing sense of finding out who I am and what I'm about and what I offer and what Jesus has for me, and also like standing against the wall and allowing people to take shots at you. And that's, I guess, part of how leadership goes. Perhaps better leaders than I take fewer shots, but for me that hasn't been the case. The question is, what book by Alan Roxburgh? I can't remember, but I will find out the title and email it to anyone who's interested, who actually emails me for it. Third question is your church a board-led church? Okay, so it went from a senior pastor model where the senior pastor had a group of elders and a group of deacons, and a few years ago it changed to an elder model where the elders would be the visionaries of the church, and pastors would come on part-time and take more of a day-to-day type of a role. It's now a hybrid since I've come here, and so what we've done is we've formed elders and pastoral staff onto one team, a leadership team, and we work in conjunction with each other. Again, sharing the same job description, difference being that staff members have time and energy, and we all work within our capacities, which I'll talk about later, which means that we do different things, different roles, but we're seen as one team. Hopefully that answers it. I don't want to spend too much time because I've got 2 more sections to get through, but those are really good questions. And again, in terms of my work here at Hillside in London, or my work at the Freeway in Hamilton, or anything else, I'd love to continue conversations as well beyond the webinar. So, moving now to the next section. These are, I want to offer four crucial components to consider and shape. Now, assuming in this webinar, because there's been a bunch of the webinars in the same series about what missional is and what that looks like, I've made the assumption people are familiar with some incarnational language, some language of being the sent people, the called out people who do and find out what God is up to in a place and follow along with it. So having said that, I want to talk to you about 4 components that I believe to be crucial. The first one is actually the most important. And context is something that I think has been hugely underrated when it comes to church leadership and church styles and church function. Context is the very place that God's future is gestating. It is in the ordinary, everyday people and places where God's future is breaking forth. And so context we've made into simply an engineering problem to solve. If you don't believe me, look at the new hotels recently built in Dubai, one of the hottest rich oil enclaves in the world, where the exoskeleton of the hotels are made completely of glass to keep the spaces completely air conditioned, where even under the sand on the beaches have been cooled with these big engineering machines to keep the sand cool. We heat our houses in the winter. We cool our cars in the summer. We believe that context is something we can master. And so one of the defaults of modernity was to believe that actually context was secondary or even not important. which is why you can walk into most churches in North America and generally find the same format of building style, of church style, of worship style. In general, there's a uniformed approach to church because it's almost as if we've moved into these places and, like European conquerors before us, have decided that we have the answers and that universal principles actually overtake local principles. My argument is that context is the primary place that God's future is gestating. Therefore, I believe it's not that we pay more attention to our demographics, or that we sit for longer periods of time in back rooms and put pins on a map to overtake a city for Jesus, or that we spend more time visionizing and strategizing and taking context into consideration. My argument is actually that we have to be part of the context in order to know where God's future is breaking forth. And therefore, we actually have to consider the fact that there is no model or theory or way of doing things that we can simply take from one context and plug it into another and hope that it works. That actually what we need to do is figure out what the Spirit of God is doing and being and is up to in the neighborhood in which we live, and in whom the people that we are called to serve. And then to do that somehow what God is doing at Hillside in London, Ontario, simply can't be replicated. We can learn from each other. We can support each other. We can help each other and encourage each other. But quite frankly, God is up to something really unique here. And unless I do the hard work of being part of this context, of researching this context, of listening to the people and of figuring out what and discerning as a community what Jesus is up to here, I believe that I failed the task of leadership. Context can't be overrated. Context is so important. So be leery of gurus who do webinars, who feel like they have all the answers and can tell you if you just plug this thing into your church, it will work. I actually am very leery of those types of things now. And more would say, find out what God has put in you. Find out what God has put in your community. Find out what God is doing. Listen and figure that out. And later when we talk about skills and capacities, I'll give you some suggestions of how that might look. But just to leave it to say, context is everything. Second thing is ethos. Ethos is the character, the values of the community. Now, often what we've done when we write value statements or mission statements or vision statements is that the guru leader would come up with, maybe even with a team, what is going to be important to people or what they'd like to say is important to people. Ethos is very different. Ethos is actually what already exists. And so the job of leaders who join communities, who are part of communities, is to figure out what God has already put there, what people already value in their lives, and what it is that they feel what things they feel are important to them, and to recognize that that ethos actually will shape who they are and the decisions they make. Now, as a leader, you can actually help shape and change the ethos of a group, of a people. But that takes time and commitment and long haul. And so when it comes to ethos, you really have to be mindful of how people interact with the things they believe are important, and that you give voice to what is already important amongst them. And then you help shape within that framework what it is that they want to do and how it is they see God working. Third one that I found really helpful is I'm less drawn to vision and mission type talk. I'm more drawn to this rhythm and rule. Now, rhythm and rule basically is rhythm is shared practices of a community. where rule are shared principles. This is all related to ethos as well. So shared principles would be, what do we think about Jesus? What do we think Jesus is up to? What do we think about the kingdom? What's our belief set about these things? Also, what do we believe we're supposed to be doing? What do we believe this looks like? What do we believe our part in this is? What do we believe God's part in all of this is? And the third part of it is, what do we believe in terms of relationships? What do we believe in terms of how we function together as a community? Whereas rhythm are the practices that work those three things out. So the Jesus stuff, that is communion with God. What practices will we put in place to identify what is important about Jesus, what we think about Jesus? So how does our theology actually get lived out into our ecclesiology? That's the shared practice, the rhythm of a community. We do these things because of this belief in God. Second part of that is the kind of commission. So what are the things that we're doing based on our belief of what God is up to in the world? What are the things that we're going to commit to as a community? And how do those come out of what we actually believe, out of our ethos, out of our sort of rule of life, that we believe God is this way and therefore we're going to do these things? And thirdly is the community piece. If we believe these certain set of things about community, about how we're supposed to function together, about how we have community with God and all of those things, our shared practices then are, what are the things that we are going to practice, to regularly commit to, in order for us to live out that community? And so the reason I like the rhythm and rule thing over vision and mission is, for me, that they're just more linked to each other and they change over time. Each community is different. Here's the things we believe. Here's the things that are principles that we adhere to, that we think are important. And therefore, here are the practices of the community, the ways in which we live those out. We call that our life together. Our life together at Hillside is, we believe these things, we have these values, this ethos, this DNA as a church community. Therefore, we participate in these things, and we do so and are committed to in the following ways. And so there's this sense that some of those things we're committed to are about individuals, are about families. Some of them are about smaller groups of people in our community. And some of them are actually corporately, as a whole church community. We believe in these practices because of what we believe. And so when you contain what the church does within rhythm and rule, it helps just to paint a picture of, there are things that we practice, that we do, that don't come from our rule of life, that don't come from our principles. And therefore, why do we do them? Likewise, there's things we believe about God, there's things we believe about the rule of life, and yet we don't have any community practices for living those out. And it enables us then to make sure that the things that we believe, the ways that we believe God works and community works, are actually practically being lived out as a community of faith. So that was a helpful picture for me to learn from a bunch of Anglican friends. The last one that I want to offer you in terms of crucial components, and hopefully this is something to think about, is this idea of fair trade. Now, what I don't mean is that your church should serve fair trade coffee. That's a no-brainer. Your church should serve no fair trade coffee, as far as I'm concerned. But that's not what I'm talking about. If you think about fair trade, here's the thing. The other day I went to go buy a fair trade t-shirt because I was going to a seminar and I was talking about this concept of fair trade church. And I thought it'd be cool to go and get one. So I went and I got it. When I got there, I found out the t-shirt was $50. $50 for a fair trade t-shirt. And the girl at the counter had a hard time with the Visa machine. It wasn't working. And so it took quite a while to me to make this transaction and shell out 50 bones because I had to count my pennies. And I finally left. And when I did, I realized that the parking guy was giving me a parking ticket because I had been too long. You know what I realized? $50 for a t-shirt plus a parking ticket. And here's what I would say. Fair trade costs money. But fair trade ensures that people at all levels are treated fairly. Let's bring that concept to church leadership. I believe that churches should look at fair trade as an example of how to establish structures, systems, and ways of doing things. I think there have been ways of us worshiping and structuring church and leading and helping and empowering that have not been fair to all people. I believe that what we need to do is to figure out ways that we can make worship more fair trade. When Jesus entered Jerusalem and went into the temple and tipped over the tables of the money changers, he was basically doing that because they weren't acting in a fair trade way. They were selling to the poor so that worship items so that those people could participate in worship. They were ripping off the poor in order for worship to happen. And Jesus didn't want to take it. I still think there are practices that we use in the church that are actually not fair trade for those who are outside of the kingdom. We need to think through our language, our posture, our worship characteristics, our leadership, how we include people or exclude them, our belief systems, our welcome, our hospitality. We have to think through all of the components that make up our church communities and try to ensure that from beginning to end they are fair and just and they're not oppressing people or holding them back. And I don't believe that particularly in the evangelical church in Canada that we can broadly claim that we have a fair trade system. And therefore we need to do the hard work of making sure we have fair trade when it comes to structure and leadership and the way we treat people. And I have been guilty as well of doing things because that's the way we've done them and not even thinking too much about how they affect others. And so just something for you to think about. Context, ethos, rhythm and rule, and fair trade. Last section before we get into some question and answer is to talk about some of the skills and capacities needed in order to lead compelling missional communities. Communities that are actually following Jesus in a particular context. And so these are some of the things, not all, it's not an exhaustive list. These are some of the things that I have learned that weren't always necessarily a default for me, or weren't necessarily easy or natural for me, but that I'm learning are really important. These are skills that I hope to hone and that I think are really important when it comes to leading communities. And so the first one is deep listening. There's only one way to actually know what God is up to in a context, in a group of people, and that is to deeply listen. The reality of it is this: there isn't a person or a situation or a circumstance in which you will ever walk into where God is not already active. I want you to take a second to think about that. There isn't a situation or a person with whom God is not already active. It is only in deep listening that we can find out what God is up to, that we can speak truth into people's lives, that we can speak truth into particular situations. It's only when we learn to listen deeply as leaders that we can tell what God is up to in our midst. My feeling is that I've talked way too much in my leadership, that I've given answers to questions people are not even asking, because I have not learned well this amazing, essential skill of leadership, this deep listening. We have to learn to shut up more as the church and to listen deeply to people, to listen for God's voice. Jesus didn't say, here's 5 bullet points so that you will know that you're a Christian and that you will know you're following the way of the kingdom, and list them out for us. He said weird things like, I am the shepherd. The sheep will know my voice. Well, if we're going to listen to the voice of Jesus, the Spirit in us and around us, we just have to listen. And so talk less and listen more. Imagination. This is a skill, this is a capacity that every leader of every organization, of every possible group or people in the world needs to learn. We have to learn to cultivate a missional imagination amongst people. And the ways that we do that are to learning how to dream big God dreams and how to cultivate that imagination in other people. Like, I try to remind myself, although sometimes I forget, I try to remind myself that God is up to something in the world. He imagines a place where justice and peace and love and hope and compassion and amazingness exists, this place of shalom. Our imagination must be the same, that God has called us to be part of the world in which we live in order to cultivate an imagination where shalom is actually possible and happens. We have to go back to the drawing board when it comes to imagining the ways that we are God's people in particular contexts. Sometimes it's by doing and dreaming about stuff we've simply never done before. We have to lead people into a place that not only have we not gone ourselves, we've never even seen before. That's what it takes. That's the skill and the capacity of a leader, to imagine that things can be different and then to figure out a way to cultivate that imagination in others as well, even while figuring out what God is up to in that place. This is huge. When I was in Bible college, I was told that if I was going to be a pastor, I needed to keep a professional edge. That somehow, as a pastor, I needed to have some distance because I wasn't people's friend, I was their pastor. I've totally kiboshed that in my ministerial life. I think we actually have to be relational people. I think we have to have a wide relational network. And I'm not just talking about people like me who are extroverted, but introverts as well. If we're going to lead a compelling missional community, we have to be known as people who are friends, as people who have a wide network of people who are different than us, who we can be relational with. We have to realize that we're not in it alone, that we are not in it alone. We are actually called to be in community. That's the gospel message. God made a way for us to be in community with himself and with others, and we need to become relational. This one's really key. If you're going to lead compelling missional community, you have to learn vulnerability. It's much easier for us to stand sometimes at a distance, aloof, like we have all the answers, like our lives are perfect. Truth of the matter is we're not. Truth of the matter is none of us are worthy of being in leadership in God's kingdom because we all mess up constantly. There's this vulnerability that happens when we're relational, where we can actually live our real, ordinary, day-to-day lives in the midst of other people, that our vulnerability somehow gives them permission to also be vulnerable and to be authentic. To be authentic. Not to put on airs, not to pretend like we have all the answers or like we have it all together, but actually to be vulnerable with each other. We don't have all the answers. Our tendency is to look at Scripture as the story of these sort of amazing, heroic, great people. But that's not the story of the Scriptures. The story of the Scriptures is not about great people. The story of the Scriptures is about weak, miserable, pathetic failures in whom, through whom, around whom, and with whom God did unbelievable things. Are we vulnerable enough as leaders to admit our weakness, our error? Are we vulnerable enough to live our real lives in front of people with whom we serve in order to say, here I am. Watch my life as I follow Jesus. You can learn to follow Jesus too. We need to be vulnerable. Collaboration. This is really key because it's not just about recognizing that we're created for community and long to be in community and are meant to be in community with others. We also have to realize that it's not just about our little silo, not just our family, not just our needs, not just our church community, not just our denomination, not even just our city, that we actually work in collaboration with people. This is learning the fine skill of leadership, of working with people who are committed to the same things, but not part of the same organization. It's about working with people who are part of the same organization and learning how to collaborate and share and give up. But it's also about learning how to work with people who don't see the world like we see it, who are not connected to our organization or even our faith, and learning how to collaborate. If you're highly relational, if you're vulnerable, you actually have a chance at being collaborative, of coming at the table and saying, I don't have all the answers. I'm a learner. My posture is to learn together, is to work together, is to find common ground rather than just the reasons why it won't work or why we can't work together. Collaboration is a skill that I need to learn and hone and practice and use because I am not an island to myself. And finally, these ones are biggie: courage and risk-taking. This is really important, particularly if you're in a community, a church that is established and learning a new way of being. It's easy for us to stay in our bubble. It's easy for us to stay in doing the things that are safe or that we know or that are familiar. Sometimes those are even good things, but it's much easier for us often to stay in those. It's a whole other thing to call people to this place that they've never been. The work of leaders is to go to places with people they have never been. That takes courage and risk-taking. That takes real commitment on the part of those who are going to lead. And so the final capacity and skill I want to share with you is that we need to learn to be courageous, to take risks. Not stupid risks, just risks that we change and try stuff, that we fix it before it's broke. That idea, these of course all work in tandem together, these skills and capacities, and are all necessary and only work when we're in and becoming part of healthy, vibrant, compelling, authentic, missional community. And so those are the capacities. There is a question here from Carolyn who asks, who do you gather to begin the transformation in the congregation when people are comfortable functioning otherwise? Great question. I don't know how you do it. I'll tell you what I do. My tendency is to talk over and over again, particularly in the role of preaching, about what is important and how this is going to work and what the call really is. Because often what happens is that people come out of the woodwork that you would never have dreamed of who are interested in this stuff and who want to be transformed. But other times it's simply in the way that you see them live their lives. There are people that you encounter who you recognize are growing deeper and deeper in Jesus and deeper into the mission Jesus has given them, and you just come alongside and empower and hold hands and hug and encourage and empower and push along and try to help out. And so that's how I do it. I also sometimes do sort of short-term learning events. So invite people to come to a day of learning about what it looks like to be a missionary in the culture, whatever. And people who are really interested will go and do it. What I don't do is spend a lot of time trying to be like a salesman, selling ideas to people for stuff that they're really not interested in, not going to be. I more live my life in the way that I hope that I draw some people by the way I live. I talk about it when I'm given the opportunity to help shape the community and be the poet. And I also am keeping my eyes open as an apostle for who else is coming along in the journey, and I try to encourage that. Hope that answers it for you. Finally, the last skill and capacity here. Actually, I've got two more, and I've only got a few minutes. So one is failure. We need to learn to embrace failure. If you're going to take risks, if you're going to be courageous, if you're going to cultivate a missional imagination, and you're going to do these things, you have to understand that most of leadership is failing. Not everything you do is going to work. You're not always going to be successful. There are things that you are not good at, and you probably won't be. Me too. We embrace failure. It's only in failure that we actually really connect with God anyway, or at least deeper with God. We connect through our failure. And the last one, this is huge, flexibility and adaptability. Leaders who don't change organizations or communities are often, the reason that that often happens is because they simply are not able to flex and adapt to new climates. I'm realizing how difficult that is, being in a brand new city, in a brand new church context, in a brand new neighborhood, coming again with the same convictions and passions and skills and understandings of who God is and what He wants as I had before, but coming into a brand new context. I have had to relearn how to be really flexible and really adaptable, how to try and fail, how to be courageous, and all of these other things. And so those are some skills and capacities that I feel like are have been being brought to the surface, sometimes willingly, sometimes unwillingly in my life, and that I believe are really important. And the leaders who I look up to, who I believe are doing courageous and amazing things in this great nation of ours when it comes to the church, the thing I love so much, those characteristics and skills and capacities I've named are the things I notice in them that I really look up to. And so let's be courageous. Let's learn how to listen well. Let's use and cultivate a missional imagination. Let's be vulnerable and relational and be in community with people and let them in. Let's collaborate together and work with people, and let's see what happens as Jesus leads us as the church in Canada into new places, into new challenges, and helps us to figure out what it looks like to be kingdom people in the time and in the place in which He's called us. And so this is the last 5 minutes or so. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them for you. And I'm going to type out my email address here for you so that you know how to get a hold of me later. And I'm going to type out my church website. And I'm going to type out my own website. Pernell Goodyear is not hard to find on the internet, by the way. You can find me on Facebook and America's Most Wanted, and all kinds of other places. So if you want to get a hold of me and be friends, particularly if you want to give me food or beverages while we talk, that'd be really great too. But telephone, email, Twitter, Facebook, any of these things, I'd love to carry on the conversation and learn together. One of the things I don't like about doing webinars is that I don't get to hear your perspective and your learning, because I'm sure that you could enhance what it is that I'm learning. And so the two-way conversation would be good for that. But at least I've had a chance today to present some things to you that I hope inspire you to be more like Jesus.
I'll just come back on here, Pernell, and recognize we may bring those echo issues back for you. But I just want to thank you so much. I thought this was really inspiring, and you had a lot of great things to say. I think, like some of the rest of us sitting here, I feel a bit awestruck, pondering over things. I guess one of the things that I'm really thinking about is the idea of posture and developing a missional posture, and this kind of came through in what you were saying. It's not about the things we do, the new models, the new programs, the new structure, but how do we reorient ourselves to God's mission in our context, in our world. It's a way of being and training the people around us to be that way. I don't see any questions directly coming in, but we do have another minute. One thing I would love to hear more about, you probably don't have time to address this, but I'm just thinking of someone like yourself in our denomination, and not to get into the specifics, but I have to chuckle a little bit. I'm not sure how we would find a fit for your radical thinking. So I guess I'm thinking about your relationship to the Salvation Army and the Baptist Church as a denomination. Obviously, there have been people that have come around you that have really shared your vision and your rhythm for what could be. Has that been an easy road? How were those connections made?
It hasn't always been an easy road, but when I was a small boy, my mom told me to be myself and to be who I gotta be, and I've kind of actually taken that to heart ever since I was a kid, And so I try to live out of my convictions, my belief about how the world is and who God is, and I try to invite other people to at least come and see it from that perspective as well. And it hasn't always been easy, but I'm not sure when we started getting the notion that following Jesus might be easy. For me, it hasn't been very easy at all, and there are times when it's beautiful and amazing, and it brings life to me, and there's times when it just feels more like I'm kind of dying inside, and so we need to be sure that we look for people around us, not only in the church or organization we're in, but in the city where we live, in the province where we live, people who we encounter who have sort of like minds, that we can surround ourselves with those people and be encouraged by them. We need to be co-learners, and we also need to have people who we know will just make us feel like we aren't crazy. Carolyn's asking a question about No worries. Carolyn's asking a question about a day of learning and what basic framework to avoid talking but then brainstorming. I actually have a format that I can send you, Carolyn. If you email me, I'd be happy to send it to you. And I've got 2 different ways that we've done those days, and they've been very collaborative and have worked really, really well, even with folks who didn't know what they were getting into. So if you want to email me, I would be happy to send that to you.
That's great. And again, I know Pernell is open to being in touch with each of us as we explore our journeys together and look for ways to be more like Starfish in our leadership of communities and the things God is doing in our communities. So I'm echoing the thanks of everybody, Pernell. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to all of our participants for participating. Hope we will see you again, and Pernell, hope we'll have you back to join us as well. We do have reminders that the recording will be available in about a week, and you'll receive access to that. And if you wouldn't mind filling out an evaluation form, we'd appreciate that as well. So I'll sign off, and thank you again so much. Bye-bye.